Tere, lugupeetud kuulajad, ettekäänd.
Dear participants, in my presentation I would like to briefly discuss how in the interwar Estonia the national identification was developed in Narva Museum, and how we had the differentiation between our own and foreign culture. I talk about the changes in the exposition because it's the most visible part. So on the foreign side, I'll discuss more the Russian heritage, which is a little bit different, a bit more conflict. Museum is not a neutral place which reflects only objective past, but it is one of the ways to construct the society where the decisions are made which kind of past will become more important for the present. So if we talk about Narva as a border zone, we have to look at the history. So this is quite separate when it looks to the context, because here we have a historically multicultural city where we have Estonia, Danish, Russian, Baltic, German and Swedish impacts. At the first half of the 13th century, a village called Narva received the city rights in 1345 from the Danish king. And then Narva belonged to German orders. Then we had Russian Tsars, and the Swedes conquered the city in 1581. During the Swedish period, Narva, old city with the defense forces, was conquered again by the foreign powers until 1917. Narva belonged under the St. Petersburg department, and it was separate from the cities of Estonia. So therefore, many demographic and cultural processes in Narva function differently than elsewhere in Estonia. So in Narva, Estonians could not be part of the city government before Estonia became independent. So after Estonia became independent, Narva used to be a border town, which was also sometimes across borders. It was our own Estonian border town. So previous dominant Russian culture became a minority culture, and the Estonian state had to now figure out how to relate to this heritage. So this border wasn't only geographical and administrative, but also cultural. But Narva Museum was a very important place where this delineation was marked. So this is the house of Peter I, who during the North War, the Russian Tsars stayed there. And these are two buildings which are built together. And as is traditional for this museum, there was a legend that there are some objects which belong to the Tsar. So it was a legend of the Russian Tsar who dedicates his life to serve the country. And then from 19th century, then here we saw a focal role in the imperium of confirming rituals, so commemorating the Tsar, Peter the Great, conquering of Narva and connecting it to Russia. Narva became the place of Russian memory holding, where foreigners didn't have much place. The Alexander II handed over the house of Peter the Great with the condition that it's going to be a museum. So the Great Guild had a heritage foundation which handled the historical collections and library. So the Peter the Great's house became part of the exposition. So that means that this house became a museum which was dedicated to two cultures. Now, looking at the local merchants, Sergei and Glafira Lavretsova, they were privately interested in collections. So we had an interesting art collection which is developed. And at the beginning of the 20th century, it was handed over to the city of Narva with the house. Lavrov's City Museum was opened on the 9th of August 1913 by Peter the Great. And at the same time, it was celebrations of the Romanov dynasty of the 300th anniversary, and Narva was part of it. So the collection of Lovretsa Museum included a lot of Russian paintings, also applied art, portraits of the governors and Russian history, the conquering of Kazan, or the copy of the painting of the conquering of Narva in 1704. In independent Estonia, museums were important places for Russian minority and emigres in order to remember the Gilded Age. Estonian state did not create the identity in an empty place, but had to work with a heritage which was alien. So according to the Estonian First Museum law, the task of the museum was the development of national cultures. So it meant studying, collection, organization, and maintenance of objects. The House of Peter the Great was a special museum. So in addition to that, had to guarantee historical and nationally important memorial which had to be maintained well. Narva Lovretsa Museum had to fulfill general functions as a museum within the geographical and historical limitations of the city. So, as Kristiina Jõekalda, who has studied this subject, has mentioned, so in Estonia we never saw the alien culture being destroyed or denied, although that would have been expected. We can say the same for Narva, where the attitude was to the heritage very rational and pragmatic. Lovretsov City Museum, which belonged to the city of Narva, first steps were made in order to rethink the exposition in the second half of the 1920s. So local Estonian community were more active, and they were very proud that the city had a museum like this. But at the same time, they were concerned because there was not much of a mention of Estonian history. One of the critics was Gustav Matto, who was a teacher, and who thought it was not acceptable that there was nothing there from the Board of Independence, which would have been easy to find and to show to the students in the museum. In Põhjakodu article, he says why Peter the Great Russian and Swedish battles have to be more important for us than the Estonian War for Independence. Based on this criticism, in 1927, there was a council of the Lovretsa Museum, and former teacher Johan Sõstar was appointed as a director. So first time ever, there was an Estonian who was a director, and the best historians became members of the council, Gustav Matto and Eduard Dickhoff of German heritage. During the 3 years when he was director, the exposition's services were extended. And in addition to the foreign history, we included Estonian history, second floor, where we had the original Lovretsov era exposition. This continued as it had existed before. In order to promote the identity, there was a separate Narva history room, where we had different items and views of Narva. For the first time, for the exposition on the first floor, which was before rented in order to receive additional income, there were different historic collections. And the expositions were made for the items from the Independence War and Estonian people, and there was a separate room for Estonian art. Now, in addition to the reappointing the rooms, the exhibition was also considered important texts. So that means that there were Estonian labels for the paintings, but that wasn't it yet. For example, some of the paintings of an Estonian artist already acquired during Lovretsov area were given a new title, or old one was implemented. So this freed the creation from the Russian and Baltic German yoke and contributed to the construction of their own identity. And at the same time not denying the alien culture. Before independence, the Lovretsov Museum had just over 20 paintings by Estonian artists. Among them were 9 paintings by Peep Aaren. Many of them depicted Russian and Baltic Germany architectural heritage. For example, there was a painting which is called memorial to Russian soldiers during the Tsarist period, received a neutral and local name, Footpath in the Dark Garden. At the same time, Aren's second painting, the Russian area view of Hermann's Tower, received a more emotional and nationalistic title, Koidula Avenue and Hermann's Tower. Of course, there was no street called Koidula, one of the symbols of the Estonian awakening period. In Narva, it didn't exist before independence, but renaming the painting helped to legitimize and consolidate the cultural continuity of Estonian Narva in the museum. But during the Soviet occupation, the paintings were renamed again. So there was monument to the Russian soldiers who fell at the Battle of Narva in 1704, and Narva view with Hermann Tower. So Estonia was occupied physically, historically, and also spiritually, cancelling the creation of an interwar Estonian identity and re-Russifying the city of Narva. However, in the opinion of the city government, the knowledge of skills of Jan Sõster, an advisory body consisting of locally history-conscious person, this is not sufficient for the modernization of museums. In 1930, a decision was made to merge the Narva City Archive and the Lavrovsov Museum, and to find a specialist who had acquired education in independent Estonia. So this was achieved by Arnold Soom, a historian, archivist at the University of Tartu. He led the modernization of museums based on the professional principles of museology and the recommendations of the employees of University of Tartu, the Pallas Higher Art School, and the Estonian National Museum. Soom chose to create two complementary museums as a strategy. From a museological point of view, it was very important to distinguish the exposition from repository. So although Peter the First House and Museum were nationalized in 1921, then substantive changes were not achieved until the next decade. But already in 1920s, a visitor could see unusual sight in Peter's house, where the middle of the portraits of Russian rulers and Narva town hall masses, there were two mannequins wearing traditional Estonian folk costumes. Unfortunately, there was a description but no photo. But as you can see on the slide, this was probably what it looked like. So under Arnold Soom, Peter I House essentially became a museum of history in the city of Narva, bringing together the cultural history objects of Narva and the surrounding area, which are both located both museums and city archives. So objects status in the building and allegedly belonged to the Russian Tsar, Peter I, or related to him, were grouped together in one room. So on the slide, you can see this space, how it looked like after the reorganization. Soom was very critical regarding the belonging to the objects in the museum to the Tsar, and he was able to identify only one object, a sword made by Solingen, on which there was a German inscription of Tsar Peter I. So nevertheless, Peter I House and Museum were preserved as the name of the museum, and it was noted in the introduction that objects in Peter's room belonged to Peter I. So pragmatism was maintained in rethinking cultural heritage, and the Russian Tsar was transformed from a symbol of the empire into a historical persona. So he became the attraction of tourism in Narva, and which had to bring economic benefits to the city. So Lavrovsov Museum became an art and ethnography museum. The curator of the new art exhibition invited Voldemar Vaga, who was a renowned Estonian art and architectural historian, who was lecturer at Pallas Art School. So during his curation, a new art exhibition was completed in 1933. So we had the painting Weining's Conquest of Kazan, which reflects imperialistic values, maintained its status. But at the same time, a collection of Russian art took a new meaning. It was not presented as a symbol of the empire, but a valuable part of professionally organized art historical exhibition alongside Estonian and Western European art. So it's true there was relatively little Estonian art in the museum, and much attention was paid to increasing its share. When starting work in 1931, Soom had to state, it would be desirable for us to have a decent overview of Estonian art in Narva in addition to Russian art. So cultural endowment and private donations contributed to this. Among them, the most significant donation came from Narva artist and teacher Eduard Berber, and his work, which mainly depicted Narva's natural areas and city views before the Second World War, formed a separate exhibition room. So today, half the paintings are located in the Estonian Art Museum, where they were taken during the Soviet occupation, reducing again the share of Estonian art in Narva. So Berber's work today is only in the Estonian Museum of Art and Narva Museum. In addition to art, local ethnography played an even more important role in shaping Estonia's national narrative. It helped to balance the foreign high culture in the museum. With the support of Estonian National Museum, exhibitions on the ethnography of Inger and Alutaguse cultures were completed. And this is part of the tangible cultural heritage which was collected in the 1930s. According to some of the contemporaries, the Narva Museum became the best museum of Ingerian ethnography in the nearby area and was valued to be better than exhibitions in Finland and the Estonian National Museum before the Second World War. Unlike the sister area approach, which aimed to give an overview of the entire Estonian ethnography, the Narva region was the focus of attention during the Soom era. So Narva City Museum was no longer a smaller copy of the Estonian National Museum, but a place for collecting and exhibiting an additional material culture. The construction of one's identity in the museum, it did not go unchallenged. When Johan Suster led the renewal of the exhibition at the Lavretsov Museum, he and the city government were accused of destroying Russian culture and extending chauvinism to such a non-political sphere as the museum. So similar attacks fell on Soom, who was accused of violating the will of the Lavretsov and destroying Russian heritage. Professional museology, where most of the objects of culture were placed in a repository and almost 10% were in exhibition, were interpreted as hiding and destroying Russian culture. So one of the most notable scandals of this period was related to Tsar Peter I, the central character in Narva in Russia. According to information published in Russian Estonian press from 1930s, Peter I's portrait went missing in the museum. It was found out when the Soviet History Museum wanted to have a copy of the painting. I'm not going to tell you all the details in the investigation, but the Estonian criminal police did not identify this as a crime. But overnight, this Peter I's painting, which did not belong to the museum collection and which has never been part of the exhibition, it became invaluable Peter I's painting. So museum received accusation of destroying a Russian culture again. In retrospect, with the benefit of the hindsight, we believe that this was information operation by a Soviet intelligence agency. So Estonian press and Narva public and Estonian-Russian relations fell victim to it. But at the same time, it should be noted that criticism of the organization of the museum did not only come from the Russian community. Local Estonian artists were not satisfied either, finding that the museum focuses too much on ethnography, leaving too much Russian art to the museum and not enough Estonian art. So the museum had become a border area where different political interests, narratives and identities competed. So instead of confrontation, the museum tried to look for a dialogue. Arnold Soom invited representatives of critical Russian circles to look around the reorganized museums, finding out that everything is still there. The Russian Cultural Association, Narva, was called upon to pay greater attention to the preservation of its cultural heritage and to cooperate with the museum in collecting it. When it comes to the folk culture, Soom wrote, I believe that we are doing the indispensable service to the indigenous culture of the Russian minority, because we are saving the material objects from destruction. Narva Museum was supposed to be the only museum in Estonia where the cultural heritage of the Russian peasantry on the other side of Narva is represented, which would have balanced the overrepresented Russian elite culture in the museum. So how much fragmented Russian community was actually ready to cooperate? But rather we have the impression that Russian communities were in a crisis of identity themselves and continued to deal with the trauma caused by the collapse of the empire. So many of them had an attitude that Estonian state is a temporary phenomenon. So museum with limited staff did not reach fieldwork on collecting the cultural heritage of the Russian peasantry until the beginning of 1940s. But the ideological political situation was changing. So feeling that staying in Narva could become life-threatening, Arnold Soom and his wife left for Tallinn, and all the initiatives in the museum were left unfinished. So this promising versatile development was interrupted in 1940s by the Soviet occupation, which restored the one-sided narrative glorifying Russian imperialism in Narva museums. After the World War II and the Soviet air bombs, both Old Narva and both museum buildings were destroyed. And thanks to the heroism of the two last directors at Narva Museum, Arnold Soom and Arnold Kotka, and individual persons before the city was destroyed, Narva City Archive, the museum collections were partially saved. So they are right now in our National Archive, but the museum collections have been returned to Narva. So during the interwar period, the Estonian state was able to carry out successful cultural integration through the Narva museums. So the foreign heritage was not destroyed, but reframed as part of Estonian history and professional museology. Narva museums became a border guard who guarded not only the objects, but also intercultural balance. Museums became an arena where national minority and local identities were held with a constant dialogue. So today, as we face new threats and changing boundaries, this historic experience is extraordinarily topical. We can see in Ukraine how cultural heritage is a target, because distorting it also means erasing the boundaries between the memory and identity. The story of Narva Museum shows how fragile intercultural balance can be and how important is the role of memory institutions in shaping and preserving identity. Thank you.